to you by the Pacific Division Sheltering Leadership. Several housekeeping items. This meeting is being recorded and it will be posted tonight on YouTube. The link is in the email that you received earlier. You should enter your own hours for this meeting, which is an hour on Volunteer Connection. If you do have questions on how to enter hours, please reach out to your disaster program manager, your community disaster program manager or specialist. Your mic and camera have been disabled. If you'd like your questions to be answered by our expert panelist, please enter them in the Q&A. The chat scrolls too fast and we won't be able to catch the questions. Feel free to use the chat to say hi to each other. I've seen a lot of familiar faces. Great to see you all coming back. This year we have 8 weekly sessions. Finger crossed that we don't have too many disasters and we can finish all 8 of them. And I'd like to welcome today's presenters. We have Alan and Chris. Alan has been a volunteer with the Cascades region since 2020, and he's our division sheltering co-lead, and he deploys often as the deputy director of a disaster relief operation. Chris is our division disaster director. Chris has decades of experience with disasters. I doubt there's a type of disaster that he hasn't experienced or if there's any territory that he hasn't been to. With that, please welcome Alan and Chris.
Great. Thank you so much, Yue. Really appreciate that. I want to just confirm, Chris, that you're with us.
Yep, I'm on. Can you hear me, see me?
I can. I can't see you, but there you are. Awesome. All right, great. So as Yue just said, I am the Pacific Division Sheltering Co-Lead. I do that with Laura Houghton. And joining with me today is Chris Boyle. Chris, do you want to do a quick introduction as well?
Yeah, sure. Chris Boyle, as Yue said, I'm the Division Disaster Director. Been around 27 years, 8 years as a volunteer, the rest of the time as a paid staff. I live up in Washington State and support the basically all of our regions in PAC outside of California for their disaster responses, and get to work with all of our regions in California as well sometimes. So yeah, that's a little about me.
Great. And I should probably mention that I'm in Oregon as well. So thanks for that. So today we are going to be talking about sheltering, specifically why do we shelter, but we're also going to talk a little bit about the other mass care activities around sheltering. And throughout this presentation, we will ask you to participate using the chat function. So please be ready for that. We're going to ask some questions. We really want to hear some of your answers so that we could kind of play off those answers and maybe make this a little bit better or stronger presentation. So if you could participate in that, we would greatly appreciate it. So with that in mind, we're going to start right off the bat on this presentation, which is why do we shelter? So if you can type in the chat, just give us some examples of why you think we shelter. Why is sheltering such a high priority for the Red Cross? So we have congressional mandate. Thank you, Vicki. Need, community safety, safe environment for disaster evacuees. No one else does it. I like that. Help people with few options, give victims a breather, support the greater community, compassion. That's part of our mission. It allows people to recover instead of simply surviving. I love all of those answers. That's fantastic. So I think you definitely, I mean, as I know, you all have a pretty good idea on why we shelter and why it's important. Part of this presentation is really kind of bringing back the why we do what we do and why it's so important. So I'm just going to start off for myself. You know, Yue mentioned that I've been affiliated with the Red Cross and Cascades since 2020. I was talking to Chris earlier today and it kind of brought all this up. During the 2020 wildfires, I had the opportunity to do a lot of different volunteering in my community, and I ended up at a county shelter that was not run by Red Cross, and I saw how that was run, and I wasn't filled with joy on that experience. So I happened to get an email. I was involved in Rotary. I happened to get an email about the need for Red Cross volunteers and support for the 2020 wildfires. I went through that process and I did a shift, right? Like an LCV shift, basically, as a new volunteer in Salem. And that was that was kind of like it was a shelter, but then it was kind of like a check-in area for clients to come in. And so I was just assigned to the front door. I welcome people in and I kind of check them in and direct them to the right place, right? So that was my first experience volunteering with the Red Cross outside of giving blood for years and years. So I did that, and I remember very distinctly that evening, this one couple that came in. The one couple that came in, it was clear to me that they were probably unhoused or precariously housed, and they were a young couple. I remember very clearly the girl's skin was dirty. So that could have been from ash. It could have been just from the way they live. But I just remember they were really dirty and fragile is kind of what I remember from that experience. And so I talked to them and got the information that was needed. And then I was taking that information to another Red Cross volunteer that was getting basically hotels for people is where we were at on that part of that disaster. And so they were working through that process, and they called me back over. They gave me a Post-it that had the hotel on it. In that time that those clients were, getting something to eat, getting something to drink, and sitting down, and they were already in a safe place, right? But what I remember so distinctly too is that I had this Post-it note in my hand that had the hotel name on it and where they needed to go. And I walked over to them and I sat down and I said, "I have a hotel for you." And the woman just immediately started crying, right? Just bawling. And it was just such a weird experience as a first-time volunteer in the Red Cross. So I left that feeling really engaged in the Red Cross mission. A month later, because this disaster lasted a little bit, I was at a hotel. I was the shelter supervisor at that hotel, and we were SRT was just kind of coming around, and there were some SRT things happening, and there was this couple that showed up, and they were meeting somebody to get a CAT card is probably what was going on. And I looked at the couple, and sure enough, it was the same couple that I gave them that little Post-it note a month before. And I talked to them a little bit and found out that he had just gotten a job and that they were moving into an apartment. And I just thought that was such an incredible story because they were very clearly not comfortably housed when they went into our shelter, but they exited that shelter with a whole new solution and possibly a whole new life. And it was just a really great experience. And that's the reason why I got so involved and loved sheltering. That was the reason why I stepped into sheltering. And so that's going to be a little bit of the theme tonight. So I know Chris has another story that's also great. So Chris, you want to share yours as well?
Sure, will do. Yeah. So many of you are probably aware, the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina is coming up here next month, I believe it is, or in August. Anybody, just curious, any of you Katrina babies or get your start during Katrina or happen to have deployed during Katrina? If you just put your hands up real quick. Looks like a couple of folks, right? Well, I just want to thank you for your 20 years of service, or 20 plus for most of you, or for some of you. We developed a lot of volunteers during Katrina. It was a time when, the country was really in a hard spot, and the folks that we now kind of call Katrina babies, or we started calling Katrina babies, y'all answered the call when we needed you most, and thank you so much for that. I think we've had some other experiences where people have been able to answer that call. Hurricane Sandy comes to mind. These are the big events that really impact our community's ability to respond, and I'm just always inspired by volunteers that just step up during that time of need. So I want to talk about that one a little bit. It was my last deployment as a volunteer. I was a volunteer for 8 years before I took my first paid position. I was assigned to the Cajun Dome in Lafayette, Louisiana. We had about 9,000 shelter residents at the site, which is a large medical facility, just a very challenging environment. The shelter was, we say it often, but it was literally a microcosm of society. Anything that you would see in a big city was happening there at that shelter, and in just a condensed environment. These clients were they were really plucked from floodwaters and then bused over to Lafayette, where they got their first opportunity to get a hot shower and some food, maybe a clean cot. And oftentimes they're arriving in the middle of the night after a long bus ride, and who knows where they had been picked up. And my example was, it started what could have been very negative, and I'll share that this is probably an example of what not to do at times, but I'm going to give it to you anyways. There was a really angry client that came in, and he was just frustrated with everything. Just, you know, you can only imagine, right? The things that are going on in this man's world, and law enforcement was very upset with him because he was so angry, almost belligerent, you know. And here's the example of what not to do. He came up to the front door and he was insistent that he was going to come in the shelter, and I was working registration. I was trying to explain to him that we were at capacity, and so I don't know where we're going to put him and how we're going to find a space for him. And it was just very chaotic. And law enforcement stepped in to, of course, protect me. But I stepped in between law enforcement and this gentleman because I just had a feeling that there was something more going on here. That's the example of what not to do. Okay, don't do that. Learn from Chris and don't do that because he's there to protect me. I knew that. But I got the man to calm down, and he explained that his wife was there and he wanted to find his wife. It was incredibly important to him. And so I said, you know, just have a seat. We're not going to be able to get you in right now, but let me see if I can go find your wife and bring her out. And I did. And they, you know, it was a great reunion. They were able to connect with each other. And it turned out it was their 25th wedding anniversary that day. And that is why he was so adamant that he was going to get in the shelter and find his wife. And it was incredibly important. They lost communication, you know, all the things. And so I'm going to find my wife today, and this is what's going to happen. And so it was a great moment. They got to celebrate their anniversary. But for me, it's about those moments when we can help families reunite, and you know, our shelters become, of course, they're a bedroom, but they're also a place to find information, find your family members, find some comfort, all those kind of things. And that was just a great story of sheltering for me and being able to see somebody reunited with their family member on such an important day during such a horrible time. So that's my story. Got a couple hands raised there.
Yeah,
Oh.
I think they're down now. So
Okay.
all right, so I'm
Thank
gonna
you.
go to start out with just a little bit about MassCare. MassCare, and most of this you guys should probably know, right? We're about delivering life-saving and life-sustaining services to meet basic needs of clients. It's about limiting the displacement, shortening the duration of displacement, and reducing the risk of long-term hardship to populations or clients that are affected by our disasters. So it's, you know, when a client shows up at our shelter, it's most likely because they have nowhere else to go. They don't have friends, they don't have family, they can't afford a hotel, there's nothing else available. They're coming because this is the only place they have to go. And those are probably the clients that present themselves with the highest need on any disaster we have, the ones that present at the actual shelter. And we're there to support someone and help them and start them on that next step of the recovery, whatever that may look like for that client. And it looks different for every single client. So the American Red Cross collaborates with local communities, states, the federal government, and makes a plan to deliver MassCare services to achieve 4 outcomes for households. And we really do collaborate across the board with all kinds of different partners. And you see that as you deploy in different disasters, whether it's church groups or other nonprofits or other disaster nonprofits. We try really hard to collaborate. I think as we move forward, you're going to see us collaborate even more and use more resources, local resources and partners to start standing up shelters and really supporting our mission because our mission's growing, because it's becoming one disaster after another. There is no breaks anymore. There's not too long ago, just a few years ago, there's always like a month or two where it was just really, and that seems to have gone away very quickly. And we don't really anticipate that changing. We anticipate that getting worse. So collaboration is essential for our mission as we move forward. So before we talk about the 4 outcomes for households and where we're at with that, we want to switch over to Rhonda Jack. She is the Northwest Regional Sheltering Lead. And Rhonda is going to share why sheltering is important to her. Go ahead, Rhonda.
Thank you, Alan. Yeah, in 2015, when I joined the Red Cross, I heard about, you know, all the different things that were available, and I thought I want to be as close to the client as possible. So therefore, I looked into feeding and sheltering. I've done both, but my first love is sheltering. And it comes to me that, at the end of a very tiring 12-hour day, you can walk away and feel like, maybe I didn't solve all the problems that there were that day, but I made someone feel better. For just an instant, I listened and talked to someone and made them feel like they weren't alone. And that kind of comes to me every time I go to a shelter. And an example of something that really sticks with me and why I continue doing sheltering is I was in Florida after a hurricane, of course, and the shelter had been open a couple of weeks. So people were getting a little tired of sleeping on a cot and wondering about their places. Do they even have a place to go home to? That kind of thing. And I noticed there was a woman, a kind of middle-aged woman, who was just sort of there on her own. She kind of walked around in a daze, ate alone, didn't talk to anybody. And I kind of watched her for a couple of days, and then I thought, so I struck up a conversation. And finally, she was able to say that she was so worried that she didn't have a place to go home to, that her trailer had been demolished, and that's all she could focus on. She couldn't focus on anything other than I just don't know what I'm going to do. So we got some permission, and she did have a car. So another volunteer and I took a Red Cross car and followed her to her trailer just to take a quick peek and see if it was still standing. It was still standing. It was fairly unscathed, so that was a huge relief for her. She wanted to check inside, so she went inside, and the volunteer and I just briefly looked in and kind of stood there outside while she looked around. And what became clear to me was that even though her trailer was standing, there was nothing inside it. She had been living with very little furniture, very little clothes, very little of anything, all by herself in this trailer. So it's kind of like your story, Alan. What that said to me is I can know that I can help her in the shelter. That's a given. We're there, we're bonding, we're talking, but I can also, with the resource of the Red Cross, make sure that she's better after the disaster than she was pre-disaster, just because of all the resources we have. And especially with the shelter transition folks, I love working with them in the shelter because it's that full circle. We can make it happen, not for just those weeks they're there, but for ongoing. And that's what keeps me coming back to sheltering.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. I really like the fact that you talked about making someone feel better. So each one of us in sheltering, we have a responsibility to our clients, and it's challenging because in sheltering, especially if there's a lot of clients in a shelter, you're pulled a lot of different directions. There's a lot of things happening, but the most important thing you could do is stop and listen to a client and try to help them in some small way. Even if you need to redirect somebody else to help you out on whatever you're supposed to be doing, the client is the most important person in that entire room. And if you're able to take a minute or a few minutes and just really listen to that client and support them, that makes all the difference in their recovery going forward. So thank you for sharing that, because it's a great example. So going back to the four outcomes that we are looking for in MassCare is to mitigate the conditions experienced by displaced people. So we can mitigate them by giving them someone a safe place, a clean place to shelter after disaster, somewhere for them to go. We want to shorten the duration of that displacement. So hopefully that clients that come into a shelter are there for as a short amount of this time as possible, and then back to their pre-existing living situation or to a new living situation. And we want to prevent displacement whenever possible. So some of the things that we could do to really prevent displacement is on those feeding routes, right? So when we're doing mobile feeding and we have clients that have no power and they have no water, but they want to stay home, We want to support those clients so they can stay home. We also support them with DES supplies so they can clean out their home and get back to their home sooner. So that's kind of how we prevent some of that displacement. And then we want to reduce the risk of households falling into poverty after being displaced. So that's super challenging. So many of our clients, when disaster happens and they lose their living situation, they don't have funds readily available to go get another apartment or pay a deposit or get another house, or they don't have insurance for their current house. There's all kinds of things that happen to our clients, but these are our 4 main outcomes. This is what we're really looking for. So we're going to go into some of the goals of MassCare, and I'm gonna ask you to add some of this in chat as well. But just real quickly, reducing the suffering of those affected by disaster. These are the goals that we have: reducing the suffering, beginning their recovery, helping them stay in habitable homes after the disaster, and then supporting the other Red Cross activities that reduce the risk of post-disaster activity. So my question for you is, what are some examples of how Red Cross reduces the suffering for those affected by a disaster? Can you put that in chat? So some of the ways that we reduce the suffering in chat is that we provide food, that we shelter, hope, medical care, IDC services, so mental health, spiritual health, medical care, so food and first aid, enabling independence. I really like that, to transition out of the shelter. So it's giving the client the room to be able to make their own recovery plan and exit the shelter. Providing security, being a good listener, all the basic needs immediately. That's exactly it, right? So we're there to meet the most basic needs to sustain life. That's what we're there for. A safe place. I like that too. So what are some examples of how do we help them begin their recovery? Can you share some examples in chat on when somebody comes to a Red Cross shelter, how do we start supporting them in their recovery? So we have putting a plan together with the client, SRT, showing compassion, interviewing them to determine the situation and needs, providing information, being an information resource, identifying roadblocks. I feel like somebody's been in SRT before, determining the immediate needs, plan for the future, help with applications for federal and local funding. I really like that. That's absolutely accurate. Giving them clothes and transportation to work. So these are all really basic needs, right? Basic needs of people. Communication, feel safe, ask to listen. Sometimes, it's just as simple as you're in the shelter, you're seeing the clients every day, and you see me on the 3rd day, and you just sit down with me and you ask me, hey, Alan, have you thought about the next steps? Like, what are your next steps? What can I do to help support you? Just starting that conversation makes all the difference in the world. Great answers in chat. So we're going to do this 2 more times. How do we, I gave an example already, but how does the Red Cross help people stay in habitable homes? So a disaster went through, maybe destroyed lots of homes, but some homes are still standing. How do we support those clients? Yeah, so providing food. Somebody talked about identifying support resources for mucking out homes and gutting out homes if needed. So working with our partners, mobile feeding routes, pods, yeah. So delivery sites, DES delivery sites, cleanup kits, shelter, going back to identifying roadblocks. Those are all great answers. Great answers. And then the last one, how does in the Red Cross, we support other Red Cross activities to reduce the risk of post-disaster poverty. What does that mean? What do you think that means? How do we reduce the risk of post-disaster poverty? So resources, community support, they don't leave the shelter homeless. So if they had a home coming in the shelter, they don't leave without a sustainable solution. Support for rent, medical support, post-disaster soft landing. I like that, Vesta. Yeah, these are all excellent. Wraparound services from the community. So a lot of this providing resources and referrals, that's heavy collaboration. That's really working with partners. That's seeing who else shows up to the disaster. You know, the Red Cross is not the only person that shows up to disaster. There's lots of organizations that show up, maybe nationally, maybe from the state or regional organizations, and then whatever organization was there locally when the disaster happened, whatever really local, like it could be a church group, it could be an Elks Lodge, it could be a Rotary Club, it could be any of those things, but who's there? So these are all great answers. So thank you for that. Perfect. All right. So I did switch the slide. We are going to now hear from Vesta. Vesta is the LA Regional Sheltering Program Lead, and she's going to share why sheltering is so important to her. Go ahead, Vesta.
So, in particular, I was asked to share about Maui. So as many of you knew, I was there on vacation with my daughter, and we got caught in the whole Lahaina situation, and evac ran around looking for a safe place, ended up at the shelter. But that's when everything started to happening. You talk about mission moments, and in hindsight, I look at it, is it the moment you embrace that you are it? Or is it the moment that finds you months later and you learn you made a singular difference, even for a brief moment? So for me, there were several of those, like stepping up with my daughter in Maui, watching her go from a victim to a client, to a shelter worker, to a dormitory lead, all within days. Learning what her character was, not because she claimed compassion, but because she showed it and even cared for burn victims and PTSD clients? Or is it like a week into it when an EMT or a nurse come to you at the shelter and said that they arrived actually hours before we did, but didn't know how to organize things because they felt powerless to help the 1,200 plus, 1,500 plus clients that were bum rushing the high school. And they were so thankful that we could provide just a simple Red Cross framework. And or with watching the clients becoming empowered and independent as they became part of their own solution, because this was at the very beginning where we didn't have a lot of resources and Red Crossers were scarce because they were taking care of their own families, so we could only rely on ourselves? Or was it watching the compassion and goodness of everyone creating the best run shelter on Maui because we all learned together that we were more powerful that way? That was such a high. It's so powerful. And I actually learned from that that I prefer spinning up DRs simply because of that dynamic. Or is it months later when I think it was 8 months later, I was approached by Joanne Nolan's friend, Catalina, and she asked us if I was at the high school shelter because her friend told her she went to the high school shelter needing relief desperately. The showers were closed and she was just filthy and bloodied and such. And I arranged for her to get cleaned up so that she could feel like a human again. I didn't think I'd ever meet this woman again or hear about it again. But apparently she's been telling people everywhere, remembered me, my name, and told folks. And um, I guess sometimes on rare occasions things go around and actually come back around, and it felt really good. And and if I have to think about the LA fires, this really prepared me for that. But more than that, it was trusting while we're spinning it up, that dynamic of everybody coming wanting to help. Whether it was, Jody was there, and we just had people from everywhere, Laura, and then we're all saying, trust me, Vesta, you've got this, trust me. And for me to trust my fellow Red Crossers who made sure I couldn't fail at my job in headquarters. And I'd never run that at a level 7 before, but I did it. Not alone, not by myself, but lifted up by my Red Crossers. So this list just goes on, and you'll find that over time, as you Red Cross, these moments will come back to you in a different way, and you'll just think of it differently, and you'll grow from it each time if you take the time to go back and revisit.
Awesome. Thanks, Vesta. I really, really appreciate sharing that. I really liked the fact that you talked about showing up at a shelter. So you showed up at a disaster, but you at a shelter, but you were already trained. You were already trained in Red Cross sheltering. You knew what to do, and you could immediately take action to support the shelter that was happening while you were on vacation. I think that's really powerful. You also talked about clients supporting the shelter. So it's not just the shelter workers that support the shelter and the operation of the shelter. Many times clients get involved in supporting the actual operations of the shelter, and especially when we're in low staff. But then the biggest thing you said that really stood out to me is that you allowed people to feel human again, right? So that's taking the time to really listen to somebody's needs and then taking action to support them to feel human again. And if there's anything that we could do for success at a shelter, if we leave a shelter and our clients feel human again, that's a success. Like we've won. Like that's accomplishing the mission.
Thanks.
So yeah. So to achieve the 4 displacement outcomes in the immediate aftermath of disaster, the American Red Cross provides the following services as part of our mass care program. So most of this you already know, but maybe you haven't thought about it quite this way. So the first one is shelter management. So shelter management means not all of our shelters are Red Cross shelters. Many of our shelters are what we call partner shelters. And in those partner shelters, there's many things that we could do to support those partners. So sometimes that's putting, just a shelter site manager at the shelter to support that shelter, to give them kind of what Vesta was talking about, that framework to really work with and make that shelter successful and really be able to support those clients. Other times it may just be, we need 100 cots dropped off at this gym. We have everything else, and that's all we have to do. And that's the partner shelter. And then other times it's still a partner shelter, but we have the shelter supervisors there, the shelter site manager there, and we're doing all of it, but it's still a partner shelter. So there's lots of different variations of how we support sheltering, but it's not always just a Red Cross shelter. But all of those shelters are really important because all of those shelters together really support that mass care mission for wherever this disaster may have happened. The second thing that we do is shelter feeding. And so most of you know that if you've worked in a shelter before, most likely you're going to be doing something in feeding at some point with shelter clients, right? So you may have a nerve team drop off meals. They may or may not be able to serve those meals. You may be doing that as a shelter worker. If it's a smaller shelter or a smaller operation, you may be ordering meals at the shelter for your shelter clients. There's all types of different scenarios. But the bottom line is that when our clients show up at a shelter, we're feeding them. We're giving them snacks. We're not counting the snacks anymore. So, just as a reminder, we really don't want to know how many snacks you serve at the shelter, but we do want to know how many meals you serve at the shelter, right? This service really ensures that those displaced individuals and families have access to meals. And then on top of that, Red Cross really strives to give solid meals to our clients. Now, I say that because I know that many of you are experienced shelter workers. You've been there, you've seen the meals that we've served, and some of them are excellent, and some of them are not so excellent, right? But the thing about sheltering is it's the immediate need, right? We want to make sure somebody has a safe place to be and that they're fed. And hopefully with time, as the shelter progresses, those feeding capabilities get stronger, those meals get better and more balanced. But that's definitely one of the things that we offer. And we also offer that in our partner shelters. And that could be the only thing that we're doing in the partner shelter is just the feeding. And then there's pet shelter. And so this has become really big in the last few years. And it seems like every sheltering opportunity we have now, we're seeing more and more pets come in, which I think is fantastic. And ideally, we're doing co-located pet sheltering, right? So we have a gym and a dining area and a dormitory for our clients. And then maybe the next building over or across the hall, there's another room that has all the pets for those clients. And that way those clients and those pets can see each other as often as they want to. And that's the ideal situation. But you'll see all types of other situations too. You may have a co-located, cohabitated shelter where the pets are with the clients. I see that a lot. We saw that in LA. You may have clients, you may have pets that are outside into a different location entirely. So it could be that the pets are all located at the local Humane Society because that's the only thing that we do. But either way, we have to find a solution for these pets. They're not going away. We want our clients to feel welcome at our shelters, and we don't want the reason why they're not coming to the shelter is because they have their 2 dogs or their 2 cats or their 5 turtles with them, right? We want to make sure that the entire family, including the pets, are welcome at our shelter. And then the last thing is shelter resident transition casework. And this is really powerful. And, we saw some of that already with SRT and the comments and chat. But SRT is really, really an incredible service. And it's not about pushing people out of the shelter. It's about finding solutions for long-term solutions, sustainable solutions for housing for our shelter clients. That's what SRT is really there for. It's about getting our clients to where they were before the disaster and hopefully better than where they were before the disaster. That's the ideal placement. SRT is really challenging and shelters are really challenging. When we open a shelter, it's not open forever. As much as we'd like to, and as much as our hearts might want to support clients forever, there is an end date, and it's really up to our clients to support their own recovery, but it's up to us to do as much as we can to support them in that process. And that's really what SRT is. Okay, so we have one more to share. We have Jody Wallace here. Jody's from NCCR. She's a mass care chief. She's also an AD of operations, and I happen to notice today that she's also on standby right now with the NIC team. So Jody, please share with us why sheltering is important to you.
Well, you could have left the last part off. Yeah, so good evening. So the first thing I want to say is anybody who knows me knows that sheltering is absolutely my passion. Even though I'm doing things up in headquarters, I am a really happy girl being able to be in a shelter and spend time with clients. I think to me, that's where we make the biggest impact. And I'm actually, as Chris said, a Katrina baby. So Katrina hit, right on the heels came Hurricane Rita in 2005. And so back then we were actually deployed for 3 weeks instead of 2 weeks. So I became part of a 6-person shelter team. And for the first few days, we were set to different places. We helped shut down shelters. We helped open shelters, but we didn't really have a home. So it was an experience since we didn't know what in the world we were doing. We just followed instructions. So finally at probably about day 5, we were actually sent to this little bitty town on the border of Texas and Louisiana, way out in the boonies. Probably took us 4.5 hours to drive there. And the shelter had been set up. It was at a middle school. So the community had been running the shelter for 8 or 9 days by themselves. So they had already received people from Katrina, and then when Hurricane Rita hit, they had additional people coming in. So they were doing this on their own. And so we pull up and we get out of our cars, and all of a sudden you hear somebody, they're like, oh, the Red Cross is here, right? We're all kind of looking at each other like, oh my God. So people literally started running out of the shelter. They were clapping and they were whooping. Thank God, the Red Cross is here. It was overwhelming because we're all kind of looking at each other because, again, 6 people, brand new. None of us had ever done this before. And we're like, okay, now what? So we walked into this middle school where, again, people are just so excited. They were clapping. Immediately, everybody's surrounding us, wants to ask questions. So, but the deputy school superintendent for the area came up to welcome us, and the nicest man. He had been there every day. He was sleeping there, and he was helping to provide meals and do whatever they could to take care of the clients. And it was obvious he was overwhelmed, just exhausted. So, you know, he just walked up, shook everyone's hand and said, "Thank you for being here." That was, and you could see it in his eyes. He really was grateful. So again, right, we had no clue what we were doing. These people had been there. So it was a matter of, okay, well, we don't exactly know what we're doing, but we know the objective is to help take care of people. And most of these people who had been in a shelter had not touched base with their families or loved ones for the entirety of them staying there, right? They had no phones. The superintendent would not let them use the phones at all. So, you know, families were very worried. So we sort of set about and said, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to accomplish this? And so that's, you know, obviously we were on the phone with headquarters going, we need some help. One of the biggest things I can always say is never hesitate. If you need help, you reach out to headquarters, to the assistant sheltering lead there, or to the headquarters sheltering manager themselves, because that's what we're there for, to help you. You know, what do you need? How do you make the right decisions? We can help confirm, hey, this is what you want to do. That sounds great. Or let's change it up a little bit. So we were able to, for the first time, 8-9 days, some of these people, they were able to touch base with their families. They were able to get glasses replaced, and we were able to make arrangements for them to come in and help get medications replaced. The biggest thing to me that I always remember is we had a gentleman who was probably in his mid-40s. He had his mother there. She was probably in her late 70s. He got called back to his job. He worked for like the Department of Transportation, clearing roads, but he needed to go back to work, but he didn't know what to do with his mom. So we were actually able to touch base with a local pastor who had a friend who ran a nursing home, who agreed to allow his mom to come in and say no charge for 30 days. So I will always consider that our absolute biggest accomplishment. She would be safe. He could go back to work knowing he had a month to figure out what to do with her. So there was nowhere for us to sleep. So we actually slept in the cells at the that they were getting ready to open, and then the hurricane hit. So that was very much an experience. But importantly, it was the first time that I realized the true impact of what the Red Cross does and what we did. And I realized, hey, I can be part of this. I can make a difference too. So as I said, right back then, our deployments were 3 weeks. So I worked that, came home, and kind of took some time to kind of process, because there was so much that had happened. And never looked back. I mean, so September will be my 20th anniversary. Things don't always go perfectly as planned or that we hope, but absolutely no regrets. Best thing you can do. Thank you.
Well, Jody, it's always good to hear from you, and thank you for sharing your story. I always love when we get an opportunity to connect, which is not often enough, I think. But thank you for your right. Thank you for your 20 years. You know, I really liked where you talked about being unsure of your role. We didn't really know exactly what we were supposed to be doing. It was my first opportunity. You know, maybe I took the class for 5 minutes before I jumped on the plane, and but you knew the intent and what we were trying to accomplish, and you worked to try to make it better for the people that you were there to help, right? And I wanted to take this back a little bit when we were talking about being a good listener, showing compassion, right? That's the name of the game. And Matthew from NCCR posted in the chat a little while back in the presentation. He mentioned, you know, being an advocate for the client. And I think, I mean, that's the number one thing that we can do. And we can't solve every problem that comes up. But I think as shelter workers, as any Red Crosser, but of course in the shelters, we're identifying folks that, you know, they don't know what the next step is. They may not have the ability to figure out how to move forward. And a lot of times we end up with the opportunity to be their advocate, try to help them figure out what the next step is. And you know, I think that's one of the most important things that we do is be that advocate. It's also about being the advocate for ourselves, our colleagues, our other shelter workers, and how can we improve the situation that they're working in? How can we improve the situation at the shelter? We're always looking for those opportunities. So I just really encourage everybody, you know, think about that. Make sure that we're being an advocate for everybody involved. So thank you, Jody.
All right, so we're going to move on to why do we shelter? So hopefully we've kind of already answered that with the stories that have been shared, but we're going to go into it a little bit more on why do we shelter. So you know, thinking about client first sheltering, and before I go anywhere on these next slides, I'd love for you to put in the chat, like, what does client first sheltering mean to you? Client first sheltering was probably brought up first when you did your training, maybe 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, or last night when you took a shelter fundamentals class, is probably where you first saw client first sheltering. But what does that mean to you? So get to yes is a great answer. When a client first walks into a shelter, I like that. Like, you know, making sure that you're giving them your full attention when a client walks in, meeting the needs of each client. The client comes first, discovering the needs of the client, getting the client out of immediate disaster or danger, immediate help in disasters, be there in the present, right? So don't be thinking about, it's really hard to not think about the 50 things you have to do to, especially when you're standing up a shelter to get a shelter started, and you have clients coming in. There's just so many other things going on. And in an ideal world, we could stop and talk to each individual client. That's not reality in the beginning of sheltering, but it is the reality once things get going and running, right? Those first few hours when you walk up to set up a shelter and there's already 50 people standing in the parking lot, you're not going to really be able to spend a few minutes with every client, right? That's not reality. We know that, but we do know that reality changes fairly quickly when things get set up and more help or support comes in, that you can really start working on that. So all these answers in chat are really, really incredible, focusing on the needs, a soft place for the client to land, listening to their stories on what happened, how were they affected by the disaster, how did they get to the shelter, acknowledging the client and showing your compassion. This is what sheltering is. This is what we're supposed to be doing, is really engaging with that client. That's client first sheltering. So sheltering is not about facilities, processes, and rules. It's about supporting people who need our help. All of those things are super important. We do need to have facilities. We do need to have processes, and we do need to follow rules. We need to do those things. But the most important thing is opening the door, putting a cot down, a blanket down, and giving a client a safe place to sleep. That's the most important thing that we do, is opening that door. And everything else can be caught up, right? So that's client first sheltering. We show compassion. So a lot of times in chat, you've talked about showing compassion and making sure that the people feel important. The shelter is a haven in which those affected regroup and consider their next steps, but they can only do that if they feel like they're being heard and it's a safe place to just be. That's the most important thing. And then we talk a lot about understanding the individual needs. So again, in your chat, when you've answered those questions, you talked about meeting the individual needs and where is that client at? A shelter is a place where clients connect with services needed to begin their recovery, right? So it's not always just Red Cross services. Many times we'll have partners in our shelters that are also offering services to our clients. So it's really just about meeting those individual needs. And then our aim is for each person to move towards a more sustainable solution, right? A more sustainable living solution is what we're looking for. And so shelters aren't open forever. The shelter is there as a community center where others can come for others might come for food or emergency supplies. Some stay at the dormitory, not always, but the shelter is eventually going to close. And our goal is really to identify how do we support these clients in their next phase, their next step as they leave the shelter, as they stop coming to the shelter for food because now their gas and water is turned on and they could cook their food themselves, right? Things like that. That's what we're really moving towards. Okay, so we've talked a lot about different things. I really love everything that you've put into the chat. I think it's been really great. It's added to the conversation. I wish we could have everybody off mic so we could really talk about it. It's not really practical with the amount of people we have, but I think this is really important. It's sort of the reminder of our commitment to walk with our clients. And so I'm just going to read some of this. If you haven't seen this before, you're going to start seeing it more and more. You're going to see it more on IAPs and DRs as well. But it's about every client feeling heard, helped, and hopeful. They're treated with dignity and respect and care. They know what to expect from the Red Cross at all times. So they know that the shelter is closing because there is a 24-hour or 48-hour notice. They know that there's food's going to be late because we were notified, and something along those lines. We notify the clients, hey, for some reason the food's late, but it's coming. You're having those communications with the clients as they're there, and that the experience of the Red Cross is the best part of their worst day. So making that happen is stopping, having those conversations, connecting with those clients, listening to what their needs are. Like Chris's story in the beginning, going all the way back to the beginning where that client, some of our clients, they don't show up in their best emotional state, right? They're showing up in every state around, like some of them happy, some of them grateful, some of them in massive fear, anxiety, stressed, angry, pissed off, like all those things. They show up in every single way. But no matter how that client shows up, we could still be the best part of their day. It takes a lot of work with some clients, but we could be that. So always remember, no one recovers alone. That's why we strive to walk with our clients on their recovery journeys. That's the most important thing. So we do have some time. We have about 8 minutes for additional questions.